If you've ever driven through the rolling hills of Buckinghamshire in the English countryside, you might have noticed something that seems completely out of place. Rising above the ancient English landscape sits a château that looks as though it's been plucked straight from the Loire Valley in France and dropped into this quiet corner of Britain. This is Waddesdon Manor, and the story of how it came to exist here, who built it, and what it truly represents is far more complex and troubling than the tourist brochures would ever tell you. This isn't just a story about a beautiful building. This is a story about unimaginable wealth, political manipulation, the exploitation of labor, questions about how fortunes are really made, and a family whose name has become synonymous with both financial genius and dark speculation for over 2 centuries. This is the story of the Rothschilds and their monument to power. So let's begin where all great stories must, at the beginning. The year is 1874. Queen Victoria sits on the British throne. The Industrial Revolution has transformed England into the workshop of the world, and the British Empire stretches across continents. Into this world of progress and possibility steps Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, a man whose family has accumulated more wealth than most nations. Ferdinand is about to embark on a project that will consume 16 years of his life, cost what would today amount to hundreds of millions of pounds, and create a lasting symbol of just how much power one family can accumulate. But to understand Ferdinand and his grand vision, we need to go back even further, to a cramped ghetto in Frankfurt, Germany, where this entire dynasty began. In the middle of the 18th century, in the narrow Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, there lived a man named Mayor Amschel Rothschild. The Judengasse was a grim place. Jewish families were confined by law to this single street, locked in at night and on Christian holidays, forced to wear identifying markers when they ventured outside. The street was so narrow that sunlight barely reached the ground. Disease was rampant. Life was hard. Mayor Amschel began his career dealing in rare coins and antiques, eventually catching the attention of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse. This connection would change everything. Wilhelm was one of the wealthiest men in Europe, having made his fortune through a business that makes modern observers deeply uncomfortable. He rented out his subjects as mercenary soldiers to foreign powers, including famously to the British during the American Revolutionary War. These were the Hessian soldiers that George Washington crossed the Delaware to attack. Mayor Amschel became Wilhelm's court agent, managing his vast fortune, and in the process, learned the secrets of international finance at the highest levels. When Napoleon's armies swept across Europe and Wilhelm was forced to flee, he entrusted much of his fortune to Rothschild. What happened to that money during those chaotic years has been debated by historians ever since. But what is certain is that, when the dust settled, the Rothschild family emerged as one of the most powerful financial forces in Europe. Mayor Amschel had 5 sons, and in a move of strategic brilliance, he sent each to a different European capital. Nathan went to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples, and Amschel remained in Frankfurt. This network of brothers, communicating through coded messages and private couriers faster than any government intelligence service, created the first truly international banking system. The brothers made money in ways that seem almost predatory when examined closely. They financed wars, not caring particularly which side won, because they often financed both. They speculated on the outcomes of battles, using their superior intelligence network to buy and sell government bonds before anyone else knew what had happened. The famous story of Nathan Rothschild and the Battle of Waterloo illustrates this perfectly. According to accounts that have been repeated for 2 centuries, Nathan Rothschild received news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo a full day before the British government knew the outcome. Using this information, he could have made an enormous fortune on the stock exchange. Some versions of the story claim he actually spread false rumors of a British defeat, causing stocks to crash, bought up everything at rock-bottom prices, and then reaped massive profits when the truth emerged. Whether this specific account is entirely accurate has been debated, but what is not in dispute is that the Rothschild courier network was faster than government communications, and that this advantage was used for financial gain. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild family was the wealthiest in the world. Some economic historians estimate that at their peak, their combined fortune represented a greater share of global wealth than any family before or since. They owned banks in every major European capital. They financed railways, mines, and governments. When countries needed to borrow money, they came to the Rothschilds. This brings us back to Ferdinand de Rothschild, born in Paris in 1839 to the Austrian branch of the family. Ferdinand grew up in a world of almost unimaginable privilege. He never knew want, never experienced uncertainty about his place in the world, never had to wonder where his next meal would come from. His education was conducted by private tutors. His travels were across the grand estates of Europe. His companions were princes and dukes. But Ferdinand's life was not without tragedy. In 1866, he married his cousin Evelina de Rothschild. The marriage was happy but brief. Just 18 months later, Evelina died in childbirth, along with their baby. Ferdinand was devastated. He never remarried, and those who knew him said that the shadow of this loss hung over him for the rest of his life. Perhaps it was this tragedy that drove him to throw himself into the creation of Waddesdon Manor. In 1874, Ferdinand purchased a bare hilltop from the Duke of Marlborough. There was nothing there, just grass and wind and sky. What happened next was an exercise in the raw application of unlimited wealth. First, Ferdinand had to literally reshape the landscape. The hilltop was too small and not flat enough for his vision, so he brought in hundreds of workers to level the summit and extend it artificially. Steam engines hauled equipment up the slopes. Tons of earth were moved. The very geography was altered to suit one man's vision. The construction process that followed was extraordinary, but when you examine the details, some troubling questions emerge. Ferdinand employed hundreds of workers, many of them local agricultural laborers who had been displaced by the mechanization of farming. These men worked long hours in conditions that were often dangerous. Construction accidents were common in the Victorian era, and while the records of Waddesdon do not reveal mass casualties, we know that workplace safety as we understand it today simply did not exist. The wages paid to these workers, while perhaps competitive for the time, represented a tiny fraction of the wealth that Ferdinand was pouring into his creation. A laborer might earn a few shillings per week while living in crowded cottages with inadequate sanitation. Meanwhile, Ferdinand was spending tens of thousands of pounds on individual pieces of art to decorate his new home. The architect Ferdinand chose was Gabriel Hippolyte de Staëlur, a Frenchman known for his recreations of Renaissance architecture. The choice was deliberate. Ferdinand wanted to build a château in the style of the 16th century, a monument to an earlier age of aristocratic power. But this was not restoration or preservation. This was a fantasy, a recreation of a past that never quite existed, built with modern money for modern purposes. The materials came from across Europe and beyond. Stone was quarried and shipped at enormous expense. Craftsmen were brought in from France, Italy, and Germany. The finest ironworkers, woodcarvers, and plasterers were employed. For 16 years, from 1874 to 1889, Waddesdon was a constant construction site. One of the most remarkable aspects of the project was the creation of the gardens and parkland surrounding the house. Ferdinand wanted mature trees, but planting saplings would mean waiting decades for them to grow. His solution: he simply bought fully grown trees and had them transported to Waddesdon. Using specialized equipment and teams of horses, massive trees were uprooted from their original locations, hauled across the countryside, and replanted on the Waddesdon estate. The survival rate was poor. Many of these trees died from the shock of transplantation, but with unlimited funds, Ferdinand simply ordered more. Think about that for a moment. A man so wealthy that when nature itself doesn't cooperate with his timeline, he simply pays to force nature to comply. Trees that had taken decades to grow were ripped from the ground and moved because one man didn't want to wait. The environmental impact was significant, but in an age before ecological awareness, no one thought to object. The interior of Waddesdon was designed to be a showcase for the Rothschild collection. And what a collection it was. Ferdinand filled his new home with paintings by Gainsborough, Reynolds, and Romney. He acquired French 18th century furniture of museum quality. Sèvres porcelain, Savonnerie carpets, gold boxes, and miniatures accumulated in room after room. The collection at Waddesdon is today considered one of the finest surviving assemblages of French decorative arts outside of France itself. But here's where the story takes a more troubling turn. Where did all these objects come from? Many of them were acquired through the art market, certainly. But the 19th century art market operated very differently from today. Provenance was rarely questioned. When aristocratic families fell on hard times, their possessions were sold off, often for far less than their true value. When revolutions convulsed Europe, as they did repeatedly throughout the 19th century, The art collections of the overthrown elites flooded the market. The Rothschilds were always ready to buy. Their agents attended every major auction, visited every financially troubled noble family, and acquired masterpieces at a pace that no one else could match. They weren't stealing, technically speaking. They were buying. But they were buying from people who often had no real choice but to sell, and they were buying at prices that reflected the seller's desperation rather than the object's true worth. This pattern of acquisition raises ethical questions that are only now being fully examined. Some works in the Rothschild collections have disputed provenance. Some may have been looted during the various conflicts that swept across Europe. Some were certainly sold under duress by families facing financial ruin. The Rothschilds were not unique in this. Every major museum and private collection in the world contains objects with similar complicated histories. But the scale of the Rothschild acquisitions makes the ethical questions particularly acute. When Waddesdon was finally completed in 1889, it immediately became a center of social and political power. Ferdinand hosted what he called his Saturday to Monday parties, weekend gatherings of the most influential people in Britain. Prime ministers came. Members of the royal family came. Artists, writers, diplomats, and financiers all made the journey to Buckinghamshire to enjoy Rothschild hospitality. These were not innocent social occasions. They were exercises in the cultivation of power. Ferdinand understood that in the British system, access mattered more than anything. By creating a space where the powerful could relax in luxury, he ensured that he would always have a seat at the table. Decisions that affected millions of people were discussed over brandy in the Waddesdon smoking room. Government policy was shaped in casual conversations on the Waddesdon terrace. The influence that the Rothschild family wielded through these social connections is difficult to overstate. They were not elected officials. They held no formal positions in government, yet their financial power and social connections gave them influence that exceeded that of most politicians. When governments needed loans, they came to the Rothschilds. When businesses needed capital, they came to the Rothschilds. When foreign policy decisions needed to be made, the opinions of the Rothschilds were solicited and respected. This concentration of power in private hands, unaccountable to any democratic process, raises profound questions about how society should be organized. The Rothschilds were in many ways a shadow government, wielding power without responsibility, influence without accountability. They could start or stop industrial projects that employed thousands. They could make or break governments. They could finance wars or refuse to do so. And all of this power derived not from any mandate from the people, but simply from the accumulation of wealth. Ferdinand de Rothschild died in 1898, just 9 years after completing his dream project. He left Waddesdon to his sister Alice, who continued to maintain the house and its collections until her own death in 1922. The house then passed to James de Rothschild, a French cousin, and eventually to the National Trust, though the Rothschild family continues to be involved in its management to this day. The transition to National Trust ownership is itself an interesting story. In 1957, James de Rothschild bequeathed Waddesdon to the nation, along with its contents and a substantial endowment. This was, in part, a response to the crippling taxation that threatened Britain's great estates after the Second World War. Many aristocratic families were forced to sell or demolish their homes. By giving Waddesdon to the National Trust, James ensured that it would survive and that the Rothschild legacy would be preserved. But there's another way of looking at this. The National Trust arrangement means that British taxpayers now help maintain a monument to Rothschild wealth. The conservation of the building and its collections is subsidized by the public. Visitors pay admission fees that go toward upkeep. In a sense, the Rothschilds have managed to get the public to fund the preservation of their family heritage while still maintaining significant control over the property. Today, Waddesdon Manor is one of the most visited National Trust properties in Britain. Tourists come to marvel at the architecture, to admire the collections, to walk in the gardens. The gift shop sells Rothschild wine from the family's vineyards in France. The restaurant serves elegant meals. The whole experience is designed to evoke wonder at the beauty and sophistication of the Rothschild world. But how much of the real story is told? The visitor's experience at Waddesdon is carefully curated. The audio guides discuss the beauty of the objects, the skill of the craftsmen, the taste of the collectors. What they don't dwell on is where the money came from, how the power was wielded, what the human cost of all this luxury might have been. This is not unique to Waddesdon, of course. Every great house in Britain has a similar sanitized narrative. The country houses that dot the English landscape were almost all built on the profits of exploitation of some kind. Some were built on the proceeds of the slave trade, some on the exploitation of industrial workers, some on the colonization of foreign lands, some on financial manipulation. Waddesdon's story is in many ways typical of its era. But the Rothschild name carries particular weight. For centuries, the family has been the subject of speculation, rumor, and outright conspiracy theory. Some of these theories are anti-Semitic nonsense, based on nothing but prejudice and paranoia. But some of the concerns about Rothschild power are legitimate questions about the concentration of wealth and influence in private hands. The distinction is important. It is possible to examine the history of the Rothschild family critically, to ask hard questions about how their wealth was accumulated and how their power was used, without falling into the trap of anti-Semitic conspiracy. In fact, it is necessary to make this distinction clearly, because the conflation of legitimate criticism with bigotry serves no one. What is undeniably true is that the Rothschilds accumulated more wealth than almost any family in history. They did so through financial instruments and strategies that were not available to ordinary people. They used their wealth to acquire political influence that was not subject to any democratic check. They lived in luxury, while the majority of people in Europe struggled with poverty. And they built monuments like Waddesdon Manor to celebrate and perpetuate their position. The question of whether this was wrong, whether it is still wrong for such concentrations of wealth and power to exist, is one that every visitor to Waddesdon should consider. The beauty of the house, the elegance of the collections, the sophistication of the gardens, all of this is real, but so is the system that made it possible. There's another aspect of the Waddesdon story that deserves attention, and that is the question of what we might call the performance of aristocratic life. Ferdinand de Rothschild was not born into the English aristocracy. His family had only acquired its title. The Baron title was from the Austrian emperor a few generations earlier. The Rothschilds were, in the terms of the English class system, newcomers, arrivist, new money. Waddesdon can be understood as an attempt to bridge this gap, to create a setting so magnificent, so tasteful, so obviously superior, that the question of the family's origins would become irrelevant. By surrounding himself with the finest French furniture, the best English paintings, the most sophisticated company, Ferdinand was making a claim to belong to the highest ranks of society. In some ways, this succeeded brilliantly. The Rothschilds were accepted into the upper reaches of British society. They intermarried with the aristocracy. They were received at court. Their homes were considered among the finest in the land. But in other ways, the project was a failure. The Rothschilds were never entirely accepted. The anti-Semitism that pervaded British and European society meant that, no matter how wealthy or cultured they became, there would always be those who considered them outsiders. This tension between aspiration and rejection, between achievement and prejudice, runs through the history of Waddesdon and the Rothschild family. It makes the story both more sympathetic and more complicated. The Rothschilds were not simply villains accumulating wealth for its own sake. They were a family navigating a hostile world, using the tools available to them, wealth and culture and social connection, to secure their place and protect their future. But sympathy for the challenges faced by the Rothschilds should not obscure the legitimate criticisms of how they operated. The same could be said of any marginalized group that achieves wealth and power. Understanding the discrimination they faced does not exempt them from examination of how they used their position. The 20th century brought new challenges to the Rothschild legacy. The two world wars devastated the family's European operations. The Vienna branch lost everything when the Nazis seized Austria. The Paris branch was targeted during the German occupation. Family members were killed. Properties were confiscated. Art collections were looted. This history of Nazi persecution is essential to understanding the Rothschilds and properties like Waddesdon. The family that built these monuments to wealth and power was itself nearly destroyed by the most vicious ideology of the modern age. When we visit Waddesdon today, we are not just seeing the fruits of 19th century capitalism. We are seeing a survivor, a remnant of a world that the Holocaust attempted to erase. This adds another layer of complexity to any critical examination of the Rothschilds. How do we balance legitimate criticism of wealth concentration and political influence with the recognition that this family was targeted for genocide? There is no easy answer, but the difficulty of the question should not prevent us from asking it. In the post-war era, the Rothschild family gradually rebuilt its position. The London and Paris branches survived and eventually thrived again. New generations took over the family businesses. The name Rothschild retained its mystique, its association with wealth and power, and a certain kind of old-world sophistication. Waddesdon, preserved and protected, became a symbol of this continuity. The house that Ferdinand built as a monument to his family's achievements now serves as a reminder of what was and what might have been. Visitors walk through rooms furnished with objects that have survived wars and revolutions, admiring beauty that has endured through the catastrophes of modern history. But the question remains, what are we really admiring when we visit Waddesdon? Are we celebrating beauty and craftsmanship, or are we normalizing the concentration of wealth that made such beauty possible? Are we honoring a family that survived persecution, or are we overlooking the systems of exploitation that created their fortune in the first place? These are not questions with simple answers. The history of the Rothschilds, like the history of capitalism itself, is a mixture of innovation and exploitation, of achievement and suffering, of beauty and injustice. Waddesdon Manor embodies all of these contradictions. It is a beautiful house with a complicated history, a monument to taste built on foundations that deserve critical examination. When you visit Waddesdon, if you ever do, I want you to look beyond the obvious beauty. I want you to think about the workers who built it, whose names we don't know, who labored for wages that would barely keep their families fed. I want you to think about the sellers of all those beautiful objects, who parted with family treasures because they had no choice. I want you to think about the political influence wielded in these elegant rooms, influence that shaped the lives of millions who never saw the inside of such a house. I want you to think about the system that makes places like Waddesdon possible, the concentration of wealth in a few hands while the many struggle. I want you to think about whether that system is just, whether it is sustainable, whether it is the kind of world we want to live in. And I want you to think about the family itself, the Rothschilds, who built this place and filled it with beautiful things. They were not monsters. They were people with their own joys and sorrows, their own losses and achievements. Ferdinand de Rothschild lost his wife and child. He never recovered from that loss. The magnificence of Waddesdon can be seen as a kind of mourning, an attempt to create meaning in the face of tragedy. But their humanity does not exempt them from examination. We can recognize the Rothschilds as fully human while still asking hard questions about how they lived and what their legacy means. In fact, taking them seriously as human beings requires us to ask these questions. To simply admire the beauty without examining its origins is to reduce them to characters in a fairy tale, not real people who made real choices with real consequences. The story of Waddesdon Manor is, in the end, the story of modern capitalism itself. It is a story of innovation and exploitation, of beauty created through systems of inequality, of power accumulated beyond any democratic accountability. It is a story that is still being written, because the systems that created Waddesdon are still in operation today. The wealth gap between the richest and the rest has never been greater. New fortunes are being made that dwarf even the Rothschild wealth. New monuments are being built, new collections assembled, new centers of power created. The names have changed, but the patterns remain the same. When we examine Waddesdon critically, we are not just examining the past. We are examining the present and the future. We are asking whether we want to continue building a world in which places like Waddesdon are possible, in which a few can accumulate so much while so many have so little. We are asking what kind of society we want to be. These are the questions that Waddesdon raises, if we are willing to look beyond the surface. The dark story behind the Rothschilds' old money mansion is not a story of hidden crimes or secret conspiracies. It is the much more troubling story of a system that operates in plain sight, that we all participate in and benefit from to varying degrees, that creates beauty and suffering in equal measure. And that perhaps is the darkest truth of all. Not that there are villains pulling strings behind the scenes, but that the system itself, the ordinary operation of capitalism and the accumulation of wealth, produces these outcomes. Waddesdon Manor is not an aberration. It is a perfect example of what the system is designed to do. So the next time you see a picture of Waddesdon, or any of the great houses that dot the European landscape, remember what you're really looking at. Remember the workers and the sellers and the dispossessed. Remember the power wielded in those elegant rooms. Remember the questions we should be asking about how we organize our societies and distribute our resources. Because the story of Waddesdon is not over. It continues every day, in every transaction that concentrates wealth in a few hands, in every political decision made by those with money and access, in every system that puts profit before people. The Rothschilds built their monument. The question for us is whether we will continue building the same kind of world. That is the dark story behind Waddesdon Manor. Not a tale of individual evil, but something far more disturbing. A story of how things work and whether they have to work this way. A story that implicates all of us. And that is why it matters.